Sometimes the hardest thing being a parent is keeping up with the changes that are happening with our kids. Sometimes it's changes in culture, but other times it's changes as they develop, changes with the way that they think or understand the world. And sometimes it's the way that their body is changing as they're growing and maturing. And recently, there's been new reports that have highlighted how things like puberty and other changes that kids might experience are happening earlier than they did maybe when we were kids, or maybe than we remember being kids. And sometimes that can kind of throw parents for a loop, and people that care for kids can feel like they're in a dark place because this is uncharted territory. Well, today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in our daily segment, Facing the Dark, Dr. Kathy's going to unpack this for us. How can we walk well with our kids, especially through changes having to do with puberty, when it's earlier than we remember it happening for us? So let's turn now to Dr. Kathy Cook.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So Dr. Kathy, we're finding that puberty starts on average 2 to 3 years earlier than in previous generations. The average age of onset is about 8 or 9 years old for girls and 9 to 10 years old for boys. That throws people for a loop because they look at kids who are older than they are and have trouble reconciling kind of what's going on. But puberty isn't really going any faster. That's kind of what they're also finding out. So some would say that kind of with this, that we want to treat an 11-year-old girl who looks like a 15-year-old girl, kind of like a 15-year-old. And the Washington Post reported earlier last week that early blooming girls are at a higher risk for things like predators and early sexual activity and drugs and alcohol abuse simply because they look older. Now, I thought this was kind of an interesting approach from the Washington Post, that we would maybe kind of temper how we treat girls who look older. I don't know if that's a secular perspective, but I think this is something kind of that we should talk about. Is it kind of encouraging young women who look older to kind of maybe be older, or maybe we treat them as they're older? Isn't that part of growing up, or should we kind of pause that? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is very interesting. And there are a lot of parents, grandparents, and educators who haven't realized how early puberty is starting. And I'm just going to say a very specific thing that's happening is girls are getting their period way earlier than in the old days, whenever that is. And so there are girls who haven't yet had the talk from a mom, and they freak out. And the schools don't have, feminine products in our elementary schools. And so that's a very specific way that this is a very important discussion, because if you're raising girls and boys in these age groups, you better have the talk about how their body's changing and what their body is now capable of. Otherwise, it's going to be a mess, down the road. So I think that's the first thing I would say. And I know I have the daughter of friends of mine looks much older than she is. And she stands up for herself. She has learned to actually ask people, how old do you think I am? And when they say 15, she'll say, I just turned 11. And they kind of, back away. But that's her way of saying, don't expect more from me than I'm capable of giving you. Because she's learned to not want to feel stupid, et cetera, et cetera. So those would be insights that I think are worth discussing.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's really a helpful kind of perspective to train our kids to kind of step into those moments and do that. And I think it's natural for parents and those who care for kids to have an idea of what young people should be doing at kind of certain age points, right? Having so many kids, we've kind of seen the gamut of this, where one kid might be asking all of the questions, especially questions on kind of like where, sex and where babies come from. And then their older siblings really aren't interested in that at all. Is there an age where we should kind of open the doors here, and maybe an age where we should keep the doors closed? And even though the questions might be there, we don't need to answer them. How should we kind of settle some of these questions when they come up?
Yeah, again, such important things for moms and dads to get on the same page about. Single parenting, man, I really feel for you. If you're parenting as a couple, then take some time to talk about these issues so that you're prepared, so that you don't react in a less than great way when a kid comes to you and says, I might be pregnant, or where do babies come from, or why are there so many homeless people in our city? I don't understand why we don't care more. So here's the thing. I think we answer the questions age appropriately and one-on-one in the room. So if a 14-year-old asks at dinner about babies and you've got an 8-year-old there, you wait until you're alone with the 14-year-old. And then I think so we answer the questions as best we can, developmentally appropriate, giving them as much information as we think that they need. And sometimes we start off by saying, why do you want to know? And then you use their motivation for asking as a boundary for how much information you provide for them. And certainly, if there's a kid who's asking a question and they're not ready for the answer for whatever reason, you can say, hey, when you're a little bit older, we'll talk about that. And then you redirect their attention to something else. Hey, let's play checkers. And you change the discussion so that they're willing to believe you that there's a time coming down the road when you'll be willing to talk with them about that.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, that's, I think, really helpful. It kind of speaks to that whole idea of development. And to close here, I'd like to have you kind of speak to, as kids are developing and understanding kind of their place in the world and how the world operates, I think that there's kind of an understanding of also knowing where their identity comes from. And I think part of an identity is really, a man or a woman, being a man or a woman. And in that, like the differentiators of that. And as kids kind of grow up and engage kind of puberty and puberty happens, they can kind of be led to have a lot of the culture kind of shape that. They could either, not really like what's happening in their body or really enjoy what's happening in their body, right? What do we need to know about identity and how it's really shaped and formed, especially as we kind of engage puberty with kids who are growing and growing up?
I would love for us to still turn to the scripture, to still turn to the Bible. And this is where we talk about, God created you as a woman, and here are the beautiful things about women. And son, God chose that you would be a boy, and we're delighted that you're our son. And these are some beautiful things I've enjoyed about being a man. So I think those are some beautiful things. We can quote scripture. We can talk about our personal lives and our story and why we are happy that we are the gender we are. I certainly hope that's true. And also, why you are creative and why you're coming into your own. And, some of the passions that you're developing now is because your mind is more able to think about bigger issues. And you're becoming even more creative because all the skills you have from being a little kid now combined with the thinking of the older kid, like, watch out, world, here you come. So I do think that we're going to have those conversations. And, how is identity formed? Ideally, under the direction of a well-meaning mom and dad. I can't say often enough that we need to put our phones down and be available when our kids are awake. Ideally, I understand moms and dads today are busy. I get that. I understand that. Many of you are busy for legitimate reasons. Ideally, you save some of the busyness after your kids are in bed, and while they're awake, you're with them so that they ask you the questions about what's happening, in their body, in their heart, in their mind. Dad, why am I so upset about the hunger? All of a sudden, I'm concerned that I'm overeating, and I'm wondering about the stuff we throw away, and I'm wondering about the hungry people. And I figured out that our church has, this food program that we offer food to people who don't have enough. Why am I all of a sudden interested? I've never been interested before. I'm angry at myself that I didn't care before. And now you're available to have that conversation about what it means to grow up and be more aware of the world around us and what God teaches us about people.
I really appreciate how Dr. Kathy kind of brings this whole idea of building identity into this conversation, especially when we talk about kind of the growing and maturing and actually forming an identity that many kids are going to experience in the coming weeks, months, and even years that they're under our care. It reminds me of a passage coming out of Romans 12, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. I think where Dr. Kathy kind of brings us with this topic reflects a lot of what Paul is talking about in Romans 12, that many times there are ideas in the world about how things should be and how we should kind of look at them and how we should actually kind of treat and handle ourselves, our identity, but also the way that we position ourselves in our identity. In many ways, kind of the way that we place our bodies in the culture, in the world, and understand how we're supposed to live in that. And what Paul's talking about here in Romans is really this idea of understanding the mercy and the grace of God to then kind of bring our bodies and bring our minds into this place where we're looking and seeking to really be holy and pleasing. Holy meaning set apart, and pleasing to the design and the will that God has kind of created us for. And in doing that, it's a true and proper way to worship the Lord. And Paul's encouragement is that we wouldn't conform our thinking or place our bodies in these different places in the world to kind of fit into the world, but that we actually are kind of transformed, that our minds are really made new inside of understanding the design of God. And as we grow and mature, that those things are kind of constantly in motion of understanding the will of God, of understanding God's design for different things and kind of exercising and living that out. I think doing that with our kids and kind of building that muscle of kind of building an understanding of what we're to do in different cultural moments, doing that will prepare them to carry light into dark places and can be an inspiration for us that we're simply living out God's design in this cultural moment today, and that'll give us courage and muscles to do it again tomorrow. And I hope that's an encouragement for you. I want to thank you for listening to the Celebrate Kids podcast in this our daily segment, Facing the Dark. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender, and I want to say thanks for listening, and we're looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow.